e4, king's pawn opening, opening line. The king's pawn opening move is both popular and logical. It controls the center, opens lines for both the queen and the bishop, and usually leads to an open game in which tactics, rather than slow maneuvering, predominates. c6, Caro-Kann defense, opening line. The Caro-Kann defense may be compared to the Slav defense against the queen's pawn. It strives for defense of the strong point at d5 and development of the queen's bishop. Knight f3, king's Indian attack transposed, opening line. d5, king's Indian attack, opening line. Knight c3, Caro-Kann defense, two knights variation, transposed, opening line. D takes e4, Caro-Kann defense, two knights variation, opening line. Knight takes e4, Caro-Kann defense, two knights variation, opening line. Knight f6, out of opening book, threatens white's knight at e4. Queen e2, removes the threat on white's knight at e4. Knight takes e4. Queen takes e4. White wins a knight for a knight. Material is even. Knight d7. Bishop c4. Makes way for a castle to the king's side. Knight f6. Threatens white's queen. Knight e5. Threatens checkmate. Bishop captures pawn. e6. Queen e2. Moves it to safety. b5. Threatens white's bishop at c4. Bishop d3. Moves it out of immediate jeopardy. Queen c7. Removes the threat on black's pawn at c6. a4. Bishop d6. Enables the short castle. Knight takes c6. Attacks black's pawn at b5 with two pieces. White wins a pawn. White is up a pawn in material. b4. Moves it out of immediate jeopardy. Knight d4. Moves it to safety. a6. Knight f5. Partially pins black's pawn at e6 and threatens black's pawn at g7. Bishop b7. Pins white's pawn at g2, attacks white's pawn at g2, and clears the way for a queenside castle. Knight takes g7, check. Removes the threat on white's pawn at g2, checks black's king, and isolates black's pawn at h7. White wins a pawn. White is ahead by 2 pawns. King f8. Moves it out of check and forks white's knight and white's pawn at g2. Knight h5. Moves it out of immediate jeopardy and threatens black's knight. Knight takes h5. Queen takes h5. Rook g8. Bishop takes h7. Threatens black's rook at g8 and creates a passed pawn on h2. Rook takes g2. Isolates white's pawn at f2 and white's pawn at h2 and prevents the opponent's kingside castle. Black wins a knight and a pawn for a knight and a pawn. White is up 2 pawns. d4. Bishop f4. Queen h4. Bishop takes c1. Threatens White's pawn at b2. Rook takes c1. Protects White's pawn at b2. White wins a bishop for a bishop. White is up 2 pawns. f5. King d2. Rook g4. Forks White's rook at h1 and White's queen. Queen f6 check. Moves it to safety, removes the threat on White's rook at h1 and forks Black's king and Black's pawn at e6. Queen f7. Protects Black's king and Black's pawn at e6 and forks White's rook at h1 and White's queen. Queen h8 check. Slightly better is Queen h6 check. Analyzing. The chess master recommends Queen to h6. You move your queen to h6, which moves it to safety, removes the threat on your rook at h1, and checks Black's king. Black responds by moving the queen to g7, which protects Black's king and triple forks your rook at h1, your queen, and your pawn at d4. Your queen captures queen, which protects your pawn at d4 and your rook at h1 and forks Black's bishop and Black's king. Black responds with king takes queen, which traps your bishop, protects Black's bishop, and triple forks your rook at h1, your bishop, and your pawn at d4. Your bishop takes pawn, which forks Black's rook at g4 and Black's pawn at e6 and isolates Black's pawn at e6. Black answers with pawn takes bishop, which protects Black's rook at g4. You move your rook at h1 to g1, which moves it out of immediate danger, pins Black's rook at g4 with a partial pin, and protects your pawn at d4. Black responds with bishop to g2, which frees Black's rook at g4 from the pin, and attacks your pawn at d4. You move your pawn to c3, which removes the threat on your pawn at d4 and threatens Black's pawn at b4. Black answers with rook to h8, which attacks your pawn at h2. You move your rook at c1 to e1, which seizes the open file. Black counters with rook at h8, captures pawn. You move your rook to e7, which checks Black's king. Black responds by moving the king to f6, which moves it out of check and threatens your rook at e7. You move your rook at g1 to e1, which removes the threat on your rook at e7. Black responds with bishop to d5, which pins your pawn at f2, attacks your pawn at f2, and blocks your pawn at d4. As a result of this line of play, the mobility of your pieces is greatly enhanced, and Black's attack potential is somewhat decreased. Additionally, the development of your pawns is somewhat improved, and the development of Black's pawns is somewhat weakened. Also, the pressure on Black's king is somewhat increased. However, losing a queen, a bishop, and a pawn for a queen and a pawn cannot be avoided. Queen h8, check. Slightly better is Queen h6, check. King e7. Moves it out of check and forks White's queen and White's rook at h1. Queen e5. Moves it to safety and blocks Black's pawn at e6. Rook takes d4, check. Checks White's king. Queen takes d4. Protects White's king and threatens Black's pawn at b4. Rook d8. Partially pins White's queen, protects Black's pawn at b4, and threatens White's queen. Queen takes d8, check. Removes the threat on White's bishop and White's rook at h1 and checks Black's king. King takes d8. Forced catches White's bishop in a trap and forks White's rook at h1 and White's bishop. Rook h d1. Moves it to safety. Queen takes h7. Attacks White's pawn at h2. c3. Threatens Black's pawn at b4. Queen takes h2. Pins White's pawn at f2 and attacks White's pawn at f2. Black wins a queen, a bishop, and 2 pawns for 2 rooks. King e2, check. Removes the threat on White's pawn at f2 and checks Black's king with a discovered check. King e7. Moves it out of check. C takes b4. Slightly better is Rook d3. Evaluating. The chess master recommends Rook to d3. You move your Rook to d3. Black counters with the bishop to d5. Your pawn takes pawn, which isolates Black's pawn at a6. Black responds by moving the queen to e5, which forks your king and your pawn at b2. You move your king to f1, which moves it out of check. Black answers with queen takes pawn, which forks your pawn at b4 and your rook at c1. You move your rook to c7, which moves it to safety, protects your pawn at b4, and checks Black's king. Black responds with the king to f6, which moves it out of check and attacks your pawn at b4. You move your rook to d1. Black answers with queen takes pawn at b4, which threatens your pawn at a4 and isolates your pawn at a4. You move your rook to a1, which protects your pawn at a4. Black replies by moving queen to d4, which threatens your rook at a1. You move your rook at c7 to c1, which protects your rook at a1. As a result of this sequence of moves, Black's pawn structure is somewhat weakened. C takes b4. Slightly better is Rook d3. Queen e5, check. Forks White's king and White's pawn at b2. King f1. leads to bishop f3, b3, bishop e2, check, king e1, bishop g4, check, king d2, queen b2, check, rook c2, queen d4, check, king c1, bishop takes d1, rook c7, check, king d8, rook c6, queen f4, check, king b2, queen takes f2, check, king a3, queen d4, which loses a rook and a pawn. Better is king d3, leading to bishop e4, check, king e2, bishop c2, check, king f1, bishop takes d1, rook takes d1, queen e4, b3, queen takes b4, rook d3, a5, king e2, queen e4, check, rook e3, which wins a bishop for a rook and a pawn. Bishop f3 threatens white's rook at d1 and blocks white's pawn at f2. White resigns.